think the perspective that I would like to sort of briefly share with you is that Sasna Tsrer is really a symptom of a deeper problem, and I think this very much repeats something that several of the speakers have already said, but not being an expert on the day-to-day politics in Armenia, what I want to do is give you a little bit more of a macro perspective. And in fact, what I want to do is start very briefly from one of the lessons of a lot of research in economics and political science over the last decades. And this is sort of also one of the main messages of Why Nations Fail, that if you want to build a healthy economic system, and I would go further, if you want to build a healthy social system, this really needs to be founded on a certain set of political institutions. This is what we called in Why Nations Fail inclusive political institutions. And what we mean by that is a combination of electoral institutions, so democracy, so the minimal definition of democracy that goes back to Joseph Schumpeter is free and fair elections. But much more than just these electoral institutions. It also requires that those who hold power are accountable beyond elections. They are checked by judicial institutions, they are checked by parliamentary institutions, but the third leg is even more important, that they are actually checked and in fact effectively share power with other societal bodies. Civil society, media need to be very powerful and vigilant in order to be able to ensure that political power is not monopolized in the hands of a narrow group, be it an economic interest or a group of politicians that have formed coalitions either with other economic agents or within themselves. This is not an easy thing to achieve. It's a tall order because those sorts of economic and political institutions are very difficult to develop, but they are the only hope that we have for a durable system in which there is equality of opportunity. And equality of opportunity is particularly important because it is the only guarantor for A, the fact that economic gains are shared relatively equally, and B, that society really uses its resources in the most efficient way. So if you don't have that equality of opportunity, people who really don't have the best ideas or the best firms or the best technologies are going to be monopolizing things. And this is sort of what you see in Armenia right now with this oligarchic structure. You're going to have that a lot of the population is not going to have access to the jobs that are going to create a livelihood for them. You're going to see inequality increase, and you're going to see a paucity of economic ideas or technological ideas, despite the fact that Armenia, as I'll talk about in a second, has access to some of the best technologies in the world through the diaspora. Of course, the case of Armenia is a very complex one because, as many of the other transition economies, it started from a political and economic system that was very heavily shaped by communism or socialism or state control, whatever you want to call it. And it had to engineer a transition. But when you look at the data, and I'm sure this is familiar to all, most or if not all of you, is that societies that started this transition process in the 1990s have really bifurcated into two groups. There are those that have engineered a relatively successful transition, such as Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, the Baltic republics, and there are those like Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, Ukraine, and Russia itself to a large extent that haven't. And you see the economic consequences of that. Some of those, like Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan and Russia, of course, benefit from time to time, at least, that benefit from huge oil revenues. And that both sort of hides the underlying institutional problems and also makes it even harder to make the right institutional transformation. But the general picture is one in which we have one group of societies that are economically successful, and another group that's not. And when you ask about what are the causes of this, I would say that, the most apparent, evident cause is that the first group really undertook a fundamental institutional transformation, not just in its economy, but also in its political system. And the second group is actually distinguished by former Communist Party members masquerading as nationalists and controlling the transition process. Ukraine versus Poland, I think, is a great example. They started more or less at the same income per capita level in 1990. Today, Ukraine is 1/3 the income per capita level of Poland. Poland has gone through very difficult times, and right now it has a very strange government, but its overall success in the last 25 years is undeniable. How did it achieve that? Well, it achieved that by undertaking political and economic reforms. Some economists really emphasize the economic reforms, but to me, the political process, which of course was helped by the process of accession to the European Union, was greatly helped. How did Ukraine do it? Well, it sort of had a group of people who were former members of the Politburo, in the Ukrainian Politburo, who declared themselves Ukrainian nationalists, just like you've seen in many other Central Asian republics. And then society sort of divided into two groups of oligarchs. The two groups of oligarchs started fighting. There was nothing like equality of opportunity. There was nothing like stability coming from political institutions. The economic institutions that followed from these political institutions were dysfunctional. They strengthened rather than weakening the monopolies that were essentially part and parcel of the way that the communist economic system was organized. And when you looked at it from this perspective, the fact that Poland grew to 3 times the income per capita of Ukraine perhaps should not be a surprise. And the problem is, unfortunately, Armenia is much closer to Ukraine or Azerbaijan than Poland, both in terms of how its transition started, even though early on it had some hopeful changes and it had some new blood coming in, but the way that it sort of evolved has a lot of the elements of Ukraine, this sort of oligarchic structure. You can sometimes have elections, but no real level playing field in the political system, which of course means that it creates a lot of economic distortions in society. And other symptoms of this is that both, as in Ukraine, when this discontent boils to a point where it actually spills onto the open, there is repression or there are other ways of manipulating it, but very little responsiveness from the political system to actually reform itself and provide real choice to people in the political arena, or real attempts to provide equality of opportunity to the people. And of course, given its fundamentals, there are many reasons for hoping that Armenia could have been much more like Poland than Ukraine or Azerbaijan, but I think that's where we are right now. Now, the question that I should have been essentially answering if I could stay longer, and I'm really sorry about that, I apologize, is about what can be done about this. And to answer that, let me go one step back and say, well, how is it that other dysfunctional systems do or do not reform themselves? And I think if you have a functioning democracy, together with some of the other supporting institutions that I mentioned that made up the ensemble of inclusive political institutions, of course, it's not such a difficult thing. You have to go to the ballot box. Political parties have to form the right sort of slate in terms of offering candidates. So there are some requirements, but people can actually vote and kick out those who are not serving them, those who are repressing them, those who are not providing them the rights, those who are not providing them the economic opportunities, and that's it. But both in semi-functioning electoral systems, such as in Armenia, or in dictatorships, the way that reform or change in institutions comes about requires more bottom-up action. So some sort of protest or discontent being communicated to the leaders. And this is a very difficult thing, and I think this is the perspective that I would like to put on the recent events, because the natural path, sort of the path of least resistance for protests, is to become very confrontational, almost violent. But when that happens, you really end up into, you go to a state where there is really no point of, it's a point of no return. And the reason for that is that if you have protests that are violent and are extremely threatening, it's like a life and death threat to the existing regime, then it provides both motive and opportunity for the existing regime to crush those protests. Why? The motive is there because, they're really hugely threatened. And the opportunity is there because they can use the presence of violent elements or sort of the no compromise attitudes of the protesters as an excuse for this sort of action. And we have seen that in country after country. We saw that actually in Ukraine with Yanukovych's regime. We saw that in Syria. We saw that in Libya. We saw that in Iraq. And in none of these cases, the situation ended up very well. In fact, the outlook of a path like this is even worse than it might first be apparent. And the reason for that is, suppose that the existing regime takes a very confrontational attitude to any demands that are going to strengthen civil society, the true democratic rights, civil rights, human rights, more economic opportunities, and so on and so forth. And there is really a violent or semi-violent clash between forces of civil society and an existing regime. Either the existing regime wins, or even if the existing regime loses, this process of violent interaction so transforms civil society that the next step becomes very hard. Because violent struggle in civil society makes the leaders of civil society come from a very different group of people than a democratic, peaceful struggle would do. And those are much more likely to take over existing dysfunctional institutions for their own benefits than try to form a broad coalition in which, a nascent form of what I call the inclusive political institutions are going to form. A trite example, of course, is the Bolshevik Revolution, but scores of examples could be found from the recent Arab Spring or other settings also. So what does that imply? It implies that there is a very, very difficult setting for civil society organizations and just a general populace that finds itself between a rock and a hard place. If you are silent, the system continues. If your discontent pours into so much confrontational attitude, then it creates a situation that both corrupts yourself and provides opportunities for the regime to crush you. So it's really a very narrow path that needs to be walked, which makes the discontent and the pressure felt on the regime, but never creates a situation which is a path of no return or no option other than violence and total sort of annihilation of all civil society organizations for the regime. One successful example recently of that is Aung San Suu Kyi. So what she managed in Myanmar, Burma, despite very, very difficult situation and despite, amazingly high levels of repression, is that she took a very principled, no compromising attitude, but was always clearly democratic and always clearly left a way out for a soft landing for the Burmese or Myanmar generals. And it succeeded. And I'm not trying to say here, I'm not taking sides. I mean, there are lots of things in Aung San Suu Kyi's program about ethnic minorities, which I do not like. But overall, her strategy of engineering a soft landing was extremely successful. But it's not a very easy one, and of course, it hasn't succeeded in many, many other cases. I mean, look at Syria, look at Iraq, look at Libya. But Armenia, of course, has some special legacies that might help it. It's got a relatively educated population. It has, compared to where it is in the world geographically, it has access to the world. And it's been a democracy for quite a while, and this democratic history has, of course, created a little bit more of an active civil society than a society that lived like Azerbaijan under, dictatorship all throughout. But when I said Armenia is open to the world, of course, this immediately brings the diaspora. And here, we are part of that diaspora talking about Armenia's problems. We have an obligation, but I would also like, even though this might be controversial to some, I would also like to end by pointing out that the diaspora's role in Armenia is a very complex one, and it has both positive and negative elements. And I think if I'm right, which I might of course be wrong, if I'm right, I think it's important to recognize these elements. In particular, it's undeniable that the diaspora plays a very positive role by being a conduit of new technologies, entrepreneurship, new human capital, and of course resources to Armenia. It plays a potentially useful role as an advocate of Armenia in the international sphere. But I think it also plays two potentially negative roles. The first one is that, as I already hinted at in the context of Russia, if you are a society that lives of rents, like oil rents, institutional transformations are harder. The great examples that the literature provides for this are Nigeria and Venezuela, two societies that have done so badly during their periods of huge oil booms. Why? Because the oil rents were a great resource over which rent-seeking politicians and oligarchs and generals fought, and the presence of that oil revenue really delayed or even prevented transition to these inclusive political institutions. So I think the diaspora's role as sort of provider of resources makes the situation harder, and this has to be recognized. Of course, I'm not advocating that those resources should be cut, but I think thought needs to be given to how those resources need to be allocated and how they go into the business community, how they go into the context of the non-governmental or governmental organizations in Armenia. The third point, or the second negative point that the diaspora plays, I think is a more nuanced one. And which is that as diaspora, of course, we would like Armenia to succeed and Armenia to have the right image in the international arena. And many of us have the natural tendency to sort of identify Armenia with the Armenian government. So when the Armenian president comes here, we all have to go and meet him. We have to interact with him because he's a representative of Armenia. But if the Armenian political regime is part of the problem, that creates a very difficult situation, which legitimizes the regime to an extent that that legitimacy gets carried back to Armenia and makes it harder to create that discontent as a path to change because the legitimacy of the government is being lost. So at some level, what Aung San Suu Kyi managed in Myanmar is that through peaceful means, she made the legitimacy of the military regime hit rock bottom. Of course, that legitimacy was never very high, but the military regime always had a legitimacy as a protector of Burmese unity in an ethnically heterogeneous place and stability and so on and so forth. And she very successfully from the beginning created an environment in which that legitimacy was very low and was declining over time, and it really forced the hand of the Burmese military to go for that soft landing. So I think it's very important, in my opinion, for the diaspora to be aware of the role that it plays in legitimizing the Armenian regime, whoever that regime is. And I'm not just talking about today's regime, but of course it does apply to today's regimes. But whoever that regime is, that you have to play a nuanced role in supporting it to some degree, but also being able to be critical to the extent that their legitimacy is not built, despite the fact that they are repressing, they are violating rights, and they are creating the wrong economic and political trajectories for the country. Thank you very much.